In 2003, a guy called Andy Rubin co-founded a little software project company that focused its efforts on an operating system. You might have heard of it. It was initially designed as a digital camera OS before pivoting its focus to mobile devices, and Rubin was nicknamed Android during his time working at Apple nearly 15 years before, and went on to become an integral part in the development process for the mobile OS that we all love today. Just a year after his 2014 departure from Google, he co-founded a little firm called Essential Products, and this, the 2017 released Essential PH1 or phone, was the fruit of his labours. A ridiculous, insane and forward-thinking smartphone that, despite much speculation and hype, was never followed up on, leaving it a relic of what could have been the start of something massive. And today I want to talk about that. But before that, guys, I'm desperately trying to hit 100,000 subscribers. So if you wouldn't mind hitting that button, genuinely, it would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you so much for your continued support. The $699 Essential PH1 launched in late 2017 after a couple of small delays attributed to a supposed certification issue, and the price was actually later reduced to $499 after low demand. And the more you look into this phone, the more you start to sort of understand this low demand. It was an eclectic mix of super high-end and mid-range parts that sort of added up to a package that was not only a little bit of a departure from what the mainstream expected from smartphones at the time, but was also just straight up bad in a lot of areas, and those areas being quite important. The Essential phone was ahead of the curve in many interesting ways. A tide of glass and metal sandwiches? How about ceramic and titanium? Yeah. The Essential phone drops the cheap, nasty glass back that we all attribute with horrible phones today for a ceramic setup that was beyond a fingerprint magnet, but helps the phone feel absolutely gorgeous in the hand with a denser weighting than many of the other phones on the market. It was one of the first phones to drop the headphone port, which went down as well as you probably imagine. It also brought flat sides long before we returned to those with the Apple 12 series. And everything from the clicky buttons to the completely flush cameras to the tiny little notch up the top and the super thin bezels at the time, when bezels were really thick on every phone, made the phone feel like one of, if not the highest end devices you could buy. It also came in some absolutely incredible colours too. This felt like one of those phones reserved for like royalty or the mega rich, but was strangely affordable for how it felt. And it doesn't stop there. You see those little circles in the top rear of the corner? Yeah, Essential sold, I kid you not, a 360-degree camera module that you could just magnet to the top of your phone. Very few people actually got their hands on one of these add-ons, but it was bonkers that this, of all things, was actually a first-party accessory. And there are samples and reviews of it out on the internet if you want to go and get lost in that rabbit hole. But we'll talk about the cameras themselves in a little bit, because they deserve their own section for being just utterly bizarre. Despite the Essential phone's seemingly high-end hardware on the surface, its maker made some utterly mind-boggling decisions in some important areas. There was no IP rating, no wireless charging, a tiny battery at a hair over 3000 mAh, USB 2.0 speeds on its Type-C port, and a 5.7-inch Quad HD IPS LCD display when almost every single one of the competition had already switched over to using an AMOLED panel. This wasn't exactly a horrific smartphone display, but it was a really odd choice, and something obviously that lacked massive contrast ratios that you get with OLED, the vibrant colours of an OLED, and the general feeling of an OLED. The display of this kind of felt a little bit washed out at times, which surely didn't help its reputation, as even back in 2017, not many people actually like this idea of a screen cutout. As small as the notch is, it's still a notch. And despite 4 gigs of RAM not seeming like a lot on paper, it was actually average for smartphones back in the day, even on the high-end ones if they weren't a OnePlus. And the 835 processor was also one of the best you could buy, so performance was clearly a priority for the Essential phone, right? Well, I remember having one of these and having some serious issues with it. See, this phone shipped with essentially like stock Android, and it was totally free of bloat, and it felt super fluid and lightweight at the same time, when we were only just really starting to see Samsung streamline its software, and LG was still releasing phones with plenty of rubbish packed into them. In theory, the super clean software would result in a pretty seamless and smooth experience, but The reality was quite different, being one of the buggiest and most inconsistent smartphones that I had ever used, and that really was weird at the time. Here's a younger version of me complaining about it back in 2018. But, and there's a huge but here, the problem is that the software is so laggy and unresponsive at times, and it crashes, and it's really like surreal, because you think of stock Android as being really light, really smooth, really elegant, and this stock version of Android for some reason just bugged a lot on the software, and it made the phone almost feel unusable at times. It was a nightmare to use, which understandably meant bad publicity for the Essential phone later on in its life, further diminishing the rather limited group of prospective buyers. The camera app isn't nearly as buggy as I remember it being. Maybe this is because it's had substantial updates since, but this just takes bad photos. It's not necessarily a bad application. It's fairly limited in modes, so can take photos, portrait mode shots, it can shoot Ultra HD 4K 30p video, but it also has a pretty prominent black and white mode. Why is this? Because one of those two 13 megapixel sensors on the back is actually a dedicated monochromatic camera that, aside from giving you native black and white photos, was meant to aid in detail retrieval, low light capabilities of the PH1's camera, and in reality it didn't do heaps from what I could tell, and so you ended up with not only a pretty limited camera from a versatility perspective, but also from a quality one. Many opted to sideload the Google HDR Plus camera app, which, as you can imagine, boosted the HDR, boosted the dynamic range, and helped the colours out a bit too, as the PH1 was known for sort of washing out things in a lot of times, with stills coming out pretty dull in many cases, even compared to sort of the equivalent OnePlus, which was not known for having good cameras. But in 2024, this camera just looks bad, although it was one of the first selfie cameras to shoot Ultra HD 30fps footage, which is kind of cool. It just wasn't a good package, and isn't to this day. While there was no official follow-up to the PH1, the company did tease one called the Gem, and there were some pretty high quality renders of it. In fact, a prototype made its way onto eBay US and actually sold for $165, which is mental. There are photos and videos of this thing actually existing in the real world, and it looks just as crazy on video as it does in renders. It might be such an insane phone that it makes the Essential phone look normal. Just wild. In 2020, the company announced that the Essential PH1 would receive no further update, and later went on to cease operations, leaving Essential a deserted company forever. Hang on a minute, wait, what? No, the story isn't over. In 2021, Carl Pei's then startup Nothing acquired the Essential product's trademarks and now owns the Essential brand. Okay, this is interesting. Maybe the story isn't over just yet. Carl Pei, the ball is in your court now. The Essential phone is one of the strangest phones from one of the most mind-boggling companies, and I kind of see what they were going for here. Imagine a phone of this size, this weight, this build materials, but with the latest 120Hz OLED screen, a more efficient processor with triple the RAM, and maybe a half-decent camera. It's a real shame that this didn't take off and that Essential didn't become something bigger. But what it did was create something quirky and wonderful for us nerds to gawp at and theorize over what could have been. This is the most insane phone that you've never heard of, a wonderful yet truly flawed piece of technology in a time capsule, and it made for one interesting story.